So this is something that we're seeing, Peggy mentioned it earlier, how people of color and disadvantaged populations have been impacted by the pandemic in some other challenging ways. And throughout our entire community, we've been having discussions about implicit bias. And I think it's important that we also bring this up in the course of the conversation as it relates to the pandemic, because implicit bias can have some mental health effects, challenging mental health effects. And we're going to start with you on this one, Rosalind.
Yeah, you bet. So, I think the probability is good that HR is very aware of how the pandemic is affecting people's bias as it relates to the pandemic and hiring practices. As you mentioned, Deidre, we know people of color are being affected by the pandemic at a higher rate than everyone else. And so that, along with the recent social injustices and inequality and equity issues that we're experiencing here in America, you can't help but to know that HR is dialed into these things and are working on how we look at biases different going forward. And so, I think from a John Deere standpoint, some of the things that we've been doing as it relates to making sure we check our biases is we've been having workshops. We've started a cohort called Men as Diversity Partners, where we have, obviously, John Deere is made up of mostly white men, and they have been willing to have a conversation around biases and checking those biases when it comes to looking at candidates for hire, when it comes to a candidate list, making sure that we've got diversity represented adequately and equitably on those candidate lists. And this is honestly a conversation that we didn't have 10 years ago, but we're having it more frequently now. And rather than it being a push, it's being a pull. People are engaged and want to be a part of the solution, and the HR is helping us drive that. Some of the other things that we've been working on is just making sure people have the empathy because of how people of color are being negatively impacted by the pandemic and the inequity issues, just creating more awareness and conversations and space for that in the workplace. And that for John Deere is something new that we just started doing this year, is having group conversations around racial diversity, and the inequities that we experience and we see here. So the other thing I would say is important is outreach to our outreach to professional organizations like National Society of Black Engineers, Society of Women Engineers, Society of Hispanic and Professional Engineers. I mean, these are things that we're really trying to do to help make sure that we get the candidates, make sure that we've got great lists, and again, continuing on with the workshops around implicit and bias, so that our employees and managers can be trained and well informed on how to check those biases when they go into discussions around hiring, promotions, and movement within the organization. Sorry, a long-winded answer, but this is so important. I wanted to make sure that I got all my points across, but I'd open it up to John and Peggy for additional comments if there are any.